somehow the conversation degrades more and more. And my first sergeant, he's standing there with his rifle. And so they're all kind of, it's like, showdown at the AOK corral or whatever. And one of the bad guys essentially tells my first sergeant, put your weapon down. And the first sergeant's like, that ain't happening, right? Well, somehow it escalates immediately to this dude raises up his weapon, and they're like, oh shit. Well, my best friend, he's the PSD squad leader for the battalion commander. So he's standing right next to the battalion commander, and all hell breaks loose.
Marshall in the middle.
Now we're rocking and rolling.
Finally got it.
Yeah. What's going on, Sergeant Major? Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. Here's life. Here's my life right now. This is how I live life right there.
Oh, wow. So where is that? Where are you?
So I'm currently in a town called Lake Linden, Michigan, which is way north in Michigan. Houghton, Chassel area, Calumet, that area of Michigan. So it's in the UP, and so it's a lake back there. I full-time RV, so I just travel all the time.
Yeah. So okay. So let's start there. Tell me, hey, honey, let's just buy an RV and just woo woo. Tell me about that.
It was actually my wife's idea more than mine. So I knew about 3 or 4 years ago, I was going into my battalion CSM job, and I knew that I was going to retire most likely after that job. And we owned a fifth wheel prior to that, a smaller fifth wheel than what we have now. But so we were kind of debating on what we were going to do. And our initial plan was we were going to go back and live in Iowa. That's where my wife's from. And so we had done we were looking for land and whatnot. Anyhow, land in Iowa is crazy expensive. And so expensive that it's cheaper just to buy an old farm, tear the house down, and build a new one. And so we were getting kind of frustrated with the search. And one day my wife was just like, hey, what if we just went full-time RVing for a little while? Okay. So a couple of years ago, we bought a bigger camper than what we had. We had it built knowing that we were going to full-time in it. And so we ordered it from the factory, and and then we just spent the last 2 years of my time in the Army. We just kind of developed the plan of how, what does it mean to full-time RV, and then I retired last year, which COVID had a say in everything, right? And so it was kind of a struggle to get through the summer. We hit the road on 1 September of 2020. And so we had to get through the summer of out processing from the Army. Plus, we got rid of 90% of our household goods. So you're trying to have yard sales and sell all your furniture and your cars. And but we did it. In July, August, we just had week after week of yard sales, just selling all our stuff. And so then 1 September hit the road, and we've been traveling ever since.
Well, that's great. Well, congratulations. We'll wait to talk about how it's been or what you think about until maybe later. We'll let you get a break on that. What time is it there? It's 10 o'clock, 10 o'clock-ish in the morning here.
I'm on Eastern time, so it's just 11 o'clock here.
Oh, that's great. So, that's great.
But it's probably a little cooler here than where you're at.
Yeah, it's nice and warm here. I got up and put my running shoes on and went to the gym this morning, but I see you got long sleeves on.
Oh yeah. I woke up and it was about 54 degrees, and but now it'll get up to 75 today. But that's what we did. That's why we did it. We said, hey, our goal is to chase 70 degree weather, and so can't argue with that.
That's great. So tell me where you're from. You said your wife. What's your wife's name?
Her name's Amanda. So she's originally from Iowa, but I grew up in Indiana. In Indianapolis. My dad was in the Army. I'm an Army brat, but not traditional. And he actually like taught recruiting school. And so, I mean, back then it was called a 00 Romeo instead of a 79 Romeo. But, so when I say an Army brat, I didn't live on necessarily Army bases because he was out recruiting most of my life. And so we grew up in Indianapolis around Fort Benjamin Harrison. That's where recruiting school used to be back in the 80s and 90s. And so, yeah, I mean, I lived most of my life in Indiana. He recruited in the battalion there and then moved over to recruiting school at Fort Ben. And then he retired and we stayed in that area. And I finished growing up in Indianapolis, the northeast side of Indianapolis. And then when I was 18, I graduated high school and I went in the Army, and I've been gone ever since, really. So
did you like know from a fairly young age that you wanted to go in the Army, or
no? I actually had no desire to join the Army. I always grew up with this mentality that I was going to be a police officer. And I mean, I watched my dad in the Army, but my take on the Army was this recruiting world, you know? And so I just had no desire to do that. But I have an older brother who went in the Army. He's about 3 years older than me. And so he went in the Army, and I was probably coming out of my freshman year of high school is my guess, if I remember right. And anyhow, I went down to see his graduation from basic training, and I just saw how it changed him. He was a Cab Scout. He went through training at Fort Knox back then, is where they had OSIT. And so I just saw how it changed him, maturity and growing up and whatnot. And it wasn't until that moment that I was like, I'm going to join the Army. And but up to that point, I had no desire, not like a hatred for it. I want to be a cop. And it wasn't like I grew up in this HUA Army world because my dad was in the recruiting world. And back then, just like now, I mean, recruiting is a stressful job. And so the idea of that's my idea of the Army didn't seem too appealing back then. But yeah, so my brother really, him joining the Army is what really made me think that's what I want to do. And I wasn't ready to go to college. I knew that I wasn't ready to go to college, and so that wasn't appealing to me either. So what do you do when you're 18? And most police departments aren't going to hire you, until you're probably 21 anyways. So I went in the Army, and I went in the Army with the concept in my brain of, I'm going to go in the Army for 5 years and get out, because as a military policeman, which is what my MOS was, is 5 years, 5-year initial enlistment. And so I said, I'm going to go in and I'm just going to get out and be a cop. And so I did my first 5 years, and actually around year 4, I got picked up to go recruiting. Actually around year 3, I got picked up to go recruiting in the corporal recruiting program. So the corporate, and back then I was the second class of corporal recruiters. So, and back then the corporal recruiting program was only a 12-month program. And now I think if they do it still, it's 24 months, but back then it was only 12 months. And so I dropped a packet, got selected, and I actually went back to my hometown to recruited out of my old high school, recruited actually out of the station I was recruited from in Indianapolis. And my intent, my honest plan was, I'll go back and recruit, and then I'll just get out and go be a cop. And so I got back to Indiana. I'm recruiting. It was rough. It's pre 9/11 time frame. It was just a stressful, hard time to recruit. And but during that time, I'm living out in the economy with normal people, civilians. And I just was like, this really isn't that hard. Being in the Army isn't that hard. And if you're willing to accept the values and the expectations of what the Army instills in you and expects of you. And so I just re-enlisted and said, you know what, I'm going to re-enlist. I don't want to get out and be a cop. And so I re-enlisted to go to Fort Campbell. And that was still before 9/11. And then I actually wound up trying to extend on recruiting for a year. By the time they denied it, I had already been there longer than my year. So that's recruiting for you, right? So they give you, hey, you have 12 months. Okay, well, I want to extend. Well, we're going to kick this can down the road a little bit. And then by the time they even denied it, I'd already been there longer than my 12 months. So I wound up doing 18 months on recruiting. And then I PCS to Fort Campbell right after 9/11. I got to Fort Campbell in October of 2001. But yeah, I mean, that's essentially how I wound up staying in the Army.
What was your MOS when you first went in? Were you an MP?
Oh yeah. I've been an MP my whole career. Went in as an MP and retired as an MP. So
were you good at all the weapons and all the, I mean, MP, look, you guys got everything from nuclear weapons to little, machetes and stuff. Y'all got crazy weapons.
Yeah. I mean, I'll be honest, I'll tell you, like when I was a soldier, just like brand new in the Army. So, I joined in 1996. I went to basic in August of 96, graduated OSIT December of 96. First duty station was Fort Drum, New York. Didn't know anything about didn't even know what Fort Drum, New York was. I was just a normal soldier. I wasn't this outstanding, great PT stud, expert on weapons. I was just an average Joe. And I mean, I was smart. I didn't get in trouble. I didn't cause problems. I wasn't I was just no average Joe. I mean, that's the only way I could describe myself. You wouldn't have been like, that dude's going to be a sergeant major one day. I mean, or he sucks. I mean, like I wasn't either one of those. And I did my job. I showed up to work. I did my job. I was smart enough to stay out of trouble. So to be honest with you, like my first 5 years in the Army were pretty normal. I think I outshined a lot of my peers and by being good and being smart, but I'm not a 300 PT guy. I'm not I mean, later on in my career, I got better at shooting. But when I was a private, I mean, I qualified marksman probably on all my weapons, and hell, I was a training battalion sergeant major, and I would tell my privates all the time, like I'd have to inbrief them when they came in. And I would tell them, hey, you know how many push-ups I had to do when I was a private? Well, first I asked them, how many push-ups do you have to do? And they're like, oh, we got to do 43. And I'm like, well, I joined 20 years ago. Do you know how many push-ups I had to do? And they're like, 80 or 70 or and I'm like, no, 43. And you know how many I did? 45. I barely graduated AIT. I mean, I just wasn't a super strong, super PT guy. And I try to make them know that, like, I was just an average Joe, but here I am today, battalion sergeant major. So yeah, that was really the beginning of the career.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Were you did you ever like find yourself falling out of a run or not being able to hang physically at a time that maybe pushed you, or did you find that you were really good at something that somebody else wasn't good at?
Yeah, I mean, there no doubt there was times where I struggled with PT. I struggled on a run. Heck, I broke my foot in AIT. We went out on a run. I can remember it. I went to Fort McClellan was where I went to basic in AIT at. It doesn't exist anymore, but that's where I went. I went running. We ran out to the hand grenade range, and on the way back, my right foot started to hurt. I get back, and we're running upstairs to change, and my foot is just swelled up like a balloon, and I go tell my drill sergeant, I'm like, my foot's killing me. And they sent me to sick call, and they're like, oh man, you got a crazy stress fracture in your foot. And so they put me in a soft shoe, and I mean, we're going to the field during this time. And I remember I'm out in the field in my soft. In fact, my drill, because it was a blue soft shoe, bright blue soft shoe. My drill sergeant, he's like, hey, you got to paint that thing before we go to the field. And so I had to get camouflage paint and paint it. And so we're out in FTX 5, our final one. And I remember we're digging foxholes, and because that's what we did back then. And we're digging this fighting position, and my first sergeant comes around, and he's like, I mean, his words essentially were, hey, private, what in the world is on your foot? And And he was like, oh, hell no, you got to go put a wet weather boot on. So I had to put a wet weather boot on. He wouldn't let me hobble around out there because I mean, really my foot was just out there in a sock, right. And a soft shoe. So yeah, I mean, I was scared. I was fearful that they were going to, I remember there's weird things I can remember. I remember asking my drill sergeant, are you going to recycle me? Because now I'm, I got this foot in this boot. And he's like, you just keep doing what you're doing and you'll be okay. And I mean, ultimately at the end of the day, and that probably hindered me graduating because like I said, I only did probably 45 push-ups on my PT test to graduate, but I couldn't do PT for so long because I'm running around in this broken foot. So, but same thing. I went, get to Fort Drum. I'm not a PT stud. I'm passing PT test, but like I said, I've never been a 300 guy. I just did my job, stayed out of trouble. And that's probably the more important part.
Yeah. Do you remember some old buddies from your first duty stations and some antics and some craziness? Were you a single guy back then?
I was. I mean, heck, I didn't get married. I'm kind of an anomaly in the Army. So, and I say that in the sense of I didn't get married till I was 35 years old. And I keep in touch with guys from my past. Even my first duty station, my first team leader. I still know who he is. He retired as a I think as a E7. We keep in touch still. Obviously social media helps that. But I'll tell you, one of the funny things is, so I went to Fort Drum as a private, right? First duty station, there I am. Well, then I go to the Sergeant Major Academy and I graduate there in 2014. And where's my first assignment as a Sergeant Major? Back at Fort Drum. Well, I go back to Fort Drum as the DES, the Directorate of Emergency Services Sergeant Major. And it was kind of weird because I walk into the PMO, physical security area, and there's a guy in there working. He's a civilian. And so I walk in, I see him. He looks at me. I'm like, old King B. And that's his name, right? Well, he was my platoon sergeant when I was a private. And now he's a physical, and he's not anymore. He's moved on now, but he lives in a different state now. But he was a physical security inspector. And I'm like, hey, he just looks at me like, are you freaking kidding me? Like, this dude was a private and now he's a damn sergeant major. And I just looked at him and I was like, guess who's in charge now? So, but another thing too, kind of weird, is we lived out on the back 40 of the installation in building P30. And so during my tenure there as the DES sergeant major, I had to be the interim garrison sergeant major for a little while. And so sure enough, one day I was out doing some building inspections or something. And I was like, hey, I want to go to this building because I want to go see my old barracks. And I did. I walked in there and it still looked the same. I mean, it had been repainted or whatever and whatnot, but I was able to go see my first barracks room when I was a private. Talk to the kid that lived there now, the soldier that was living in there. But yeah, I mean, the Army back then was different than it is now. And I don't say that in a bad way. I say that in the sense of, back then we probably did more barracks partying, because we didn't have social media. We didn't have video games necessarily. I mean, some people had a Nintendo or a Sega or, whatever existed back then. But, we probably did a whole lot more hanging out, and even, it's a conversation I had with people about the mental health of soldiers today. And I tell them, I say, hey, I'm a firm believer that soldiers I think back then, I'm going to use my hand here to represent something, but so let's say this is balance. This is just normal life, right? And I think that this is how we used to live, and we would fluctuate to highs and lows, right? But what would happen is, so you're living here, you're partying in the barracks, it's a good time, then you're back here living normal, and then something depressing happens in your life and you get a little depressed, right? Well, back then, if you got depressed, what'd you do? You walk down the hallway, bang on your buddy's door. Hey man, my girlfriend broke up with me, or whatever the drama is in your life at that time. And they're like, screw that, let's go party, right? And so you'd go to the local club or you go down to the day room and they bring you back from depression up to normal, right? Well, the conversation I have with a lot of people now is that I think because of video games and social media, people live in a depressed state. and that's normal, but depression is normal now. And so what happens though is that today's soldier lives in the barracks. They're more secluded because we divide them, give them their own living space. Now they get depressed, and now they become really depressed because they're already depressed. That's normal. Now they become really depressed. Well, the problem is they don't walk down the hallway and tell their buddies. They sit in their barracks room and they are, just sulking their problems instead of going down there and talking to their buddy, and their buddy being like, screw it, let's go party. And that's unfortunate because I think that leads to a lot of those problems. So I think that's probably a big difference of how life was then versus now.
I'm into that. I agree. I remember praying many nights about some of my soldiers. I had high risk soldiers that I was worried about at times when I was a leader, that you had to. I remember as a first sergeant, my command sergeant major he would call me in his office. He goes, when something goes bad with one of your soldiers, who's it going to be? And I'm like, what? He's like, something's going to go bad at some point. Who's it going to be? What's it going to be? And I'm like, and I'd have to give him a name and what would happen. And he'd say, go stop that from happening. I'm like, okay, all right, Sergeant Major, I got it, But it was very direct marching orders that this particular command sergeant major gave me, but it made me broaden my view.
Yeah.
I gotta be a sponge somehow. And
yep.
Yeah. So, hey, great observation. Thanks for sharing about what you're thinking. Tell me about some good times you had in the military. Did you have some great teams you were on? You have some wonderful mentors?
I mean, I got lucky, I think. When I showed up to my first duty station, my first team leader, he was an awesome team leader. He didn't treat me like crap, like he treated me like the person that I was. And I would tell you, like, in a way that could have been to a detriment, because then I had a second team leader and he was really put there because he's like, you're too buddy with your team leader. Looking back, I can buy that a little bit, but I think it set me up for this success of not thinking the Army sucked. You get a lot of soldiers that show up and their team leaders treat them like crap from jump, and then they're like, this sucks. Why do I even want to be here? So I had good team leaders. Then I went from Fort Drum to Germany. I had a good team leader there. I'm still friends with him. He's a cop out in the San Diego area now. But so then I left Germany, went recruiting. That was its own beast. I mean, recruiting is the toughest job in the Army. I tell anybody that. You couldn't get me to go back to recruiting. You couldn't pay me enough to do that. You could pay me enough to go be a drill sergeant again, but not to be a recruiter. And then from recruiting, I mean, the people I recruited with, they were cool. I mean, it's its own world though. It's different. So then obviously 9/11 happens. I went to Fort Campbell, and that's probably where my tightest, most fun time in the Army was, because we're deploying, I mean, OAF-1 kicks off. I mean, we went to Afghanistan right when it kicked off. We turn around, we come back. Then Iraq kicks off, a year later, we go right back to Iraq. And those are, my best friend, he was from that era. He's a state representative out in Oklahoma now. But we talk weekly, and man, it's just the times we had were incredible. We deployed together. He wound up getting shot, and injured and evac'd out of Iraq. I was in that firefight with him. So you just have that bond. But every weekend, we're barbecuing, we're hanging out at each other's house, and even to this day, we bounce everything off each other. We still have that heavy bond. Then I mean, that, like I said, that was probably the tightest and most fun time I had in the Army. Then I was a drill sergeant after that. So 04, 05, 06 era, I was a drill sergeant. I was actually a drill sergeant at Fort Jackson. A lot of MPs down there, though, surprisingly enough, because MPs train at Fort Leonard Wood. But we had a lot of MP drill sergeants. I'm friends with them still. And we were tight, too. I mean, we had a good crew of drill sergeants. We'd all just come back from war, from OIF-1. And so we understood the reality. And not to say that the generation before us didn't understand the reality. They just, unfortunately, didn't have the experience of being able to go and do it, and it caused some drama between the new generation of drill sergeant and that previous, the generation that didn't go to war yet. Trust me, there was some drama there. But those guys understood being drill sergeants, and we understood going to war, and it worked out in the long run, but we had a good time being drill sergeants. That's probably the most, like, being at Fort Campbell was fun, but being a drill sergeant was a lot of fun because as long as you care about training Joe, you're not there to treat him like crap. And then I was at Fort Riley after that. I spent a lot of time at Fort Riley. I was at Fort Riley for like 7 years as a platoon sergeant, an ops sergeant, a first sergeant. Then I got selected to be sergeant major, so I left. But I deployed a company as a first sergeant. That to me was a lot of fun. We owned our own base camp. We had a lot of fun with it. Our battalion leadership always used to say, "Oh, that's the Taj Mahal out there." You're right, because we put the energy and time into making it worth being at. It wasn't big Kandahar or Bagram. It was a little base camp, but we made it good life, and I had soldiers that had to live outlying in police stations, and life sucked for them. But we would, when they got a chance to come see home, the base camp, our Cop Shurendam, we wanted to make sure that it was worth coming to, but yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I tell people all the time, like, I love my time in the Army. When I retired, it was time to retire. I was more than happy to retire. Also, don't be fooled. But I didn't retire because I had an issue with the Army. I retired because I was just ready to do something else, and the cost benefit was more beneficial to me just to get out.
Yeah, I had a very, very similar decision at the time when I decided to get out. It wasn't like I was mad with the Army or nothing, but it was just time to go and do other things, and I'm glad I did. Tell me, if you don't mind, I want to take you back, if you don't mind, eventually to, pulling the trigger on your weapon, when you were at war at the bad guys. But before that, tell me a little bit about drill sergeant school. Did you enjoy drill sergeant school? That's got to be a weird thing, right?
It was. I went through drill sergeant school, like I said, right after IF1, and I think the biggest struggle for drill sergeant school was, one, back then we wore BDUs still. And so I'd been gone downrange for a year wearing desert uniform, DCUs back then. And so then we go to drill sergeant school, and it's like, oh, you got to have these highly pressed uniforms again, and you got to have these nice shined boots. Well, for a while, my boots sucked because they'd been just sitting in a closet for a year, and they were pretty dried out, coming back from war. And but also, like, I mean, drill sergeant school wasn't hard to me. Obviously, you got to know memorization because you got to pitch modules and whatnot. To me, I think the harder part was there's a lot of people around you that can't swallow their ego. I can remember clear as day, people running, I'm a sergeant first class. Why is this guy talking to me like and I'm like, just play the game, man. Like, why you're here, right? Like don't buck the system, because you're not going to win. You're not going to defeat. It's just like privates. You're not going to defeat the system. You can come here and try to be hardcore, back on the block all you want, but we're going to win. So, you're here for a reason. Suck it up and just do it. So, and back then I went to drill sergeant school at Fort Jackson, and it was in a different location than it is now. So it was really weird because drill sergeant school was actually in the same footprint as incoming privates to Fort Jackson. Yeah, it was weird. And also, like, the soldiers that got injured and they had to go back to recover, whatever the FTC or whatever, I don't remember what it was, but these soldiers are injured, and so they have to it's a recovery area for them. Well, they would see us out there on the quad marching around, looking all jacked up because some of us don't know how to march, or we'd go to the same DFAC as these privates, right? And so we're standing there being treated like privates, standing parade rest, and the drill sergeant leaders are like, pitch this module, pitch that module, and you're like literally standing next to a private, and you don't know it. You're all jacked up, right? Well, then, like, later on, you might run into that private because they get released from recovery, right? So now they're fixed and recovered, and like there was people out there that private would be like, I know you, drill sergeant. You're like, you don't know me. And they're like, yeah, you stood next to me in the chow line. And you're like, God dang, man. Like, that was one of our biggest complaints, because we're like, hey, we eventually run into these privates and we looked like jackasses, 6 months ago, and they know that. and it kind of ruins a little bit. So obviously drill sergeant schools moved to a different part of the installation now, and they don't, I don't think, deal with that anymore. But that was probably the biggest weird part of drill sergeant school. I mean, I volunteered to be there. I wanted to be a drill sergeant, so I mean, I was along for the ride. It was good.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So tell me about, gearing up and people issuing you bullets and you know, going off to go fight the enemy in a foreign land. I mean, that's got to be I know it was tough for me when they started doing those things. So what did you think about?
Yeah. So, I just come off recruiting, which was kind of weird, right? You're coming out of recruiting and now it's like, hey, and oh man, it can be a long story. I'll try not to make it too long, but I'll tell you this. Understand this first of all. When 9/11 happened, I was on a bus as a recruiter on my way to the field. That may sound weird, right? Okay. Now here's why though. I was in PLDC when now known as Basic Leader Course, but I was in PLDC when 9/11 happened. So I went as a corporal on recruiting, got promoted to sergeant, went to PLDC at Fort Knox. 9/11 happened to be the day we deployed to the field to do our field problem and do our land nav and all that kind of stuff. And so we're on a bus and we hear on the radio something about something happening. Nobody really knew anything. I'm in the field for 5 days after that. So I will tell you that the impact to me for 9/11 is not the same as it was probably for you. I didn't sit at a TV and watch it happen. I didn't have to deal with oh my gosh, the world. I was literally out in the woods. I had no idea what was going on back in the free world, right? Like I'm just living in the woods. So anyhow, I graduate PLDC. I go back to recruiting. I clear, now I'm like seeing oh my God, like it's kind of weird to me. Like I'm driving around, there's American flags everywhere and you're in uniform and people think you're the greatest thing in the world. Whereas when I went to PLDC, there was no 9/11 and no one cared, right? I'm not joining the Army. All right. So now I PCS to Fort Campbell and I get there in October of 2001. And then like February 2002, we go to Afghanistan. So that was really the first time that I dealt with deployment, like that type of. I've been to Bosnia, I'd been to Panama, but that was like, oh my gosh, like this is the real deal, right? And so I go to my first deployment was we went to Afghanistan. Our job was to transport prisoners from Kandahar to Cuba on a plane as military policemen. It was a joint venture between us and the Air Force. And so we had to go train up at Fort Dix for a while. And then we deployed. It wasn't a super long deployment, but we were like, you flew into Kandahar, you picked up prisoners in the middle of the night, you flew them back to Turkey, you put them on a different plane, then you flew them to Cuba. It was like a 24-hour flight straight through, 2 or 3 in-flight refuelings. It's pretty wild, right? And that's the first, I'm standing from, 5 feet away from these prisoners on this plane, and they're all handcuffed and blindfolded. It was just pretty wild, and 24 hours later, you land in Cuba and hand them off to the Marines, and then they go put them in Camp X-Ray or whatever it's called. And that's where they stayed. So we did that. Like I said, it wasn't a super long mission, but we transported all those guys down there. Well, then go back to Fort Campbell, spend a year back at Fort Campbell, go to air assault school, eventually get promoted to staff sergeant. Now OIF is kicking off. And I don't know that the surrealism was the same because it's Iraq and we weren't really fighting them yet, right? Like, hey, we've declared that we're going to go remove Saddam Hussein and that regime, but we're really just the 101st is deploying to Kuwait, waiting to make the move. So we get there and we're in Kuwait for a little bit, just in 10 cities waiting to cross the berm. And then it was kind of weird though, because like all of a sudden one night they're just like, hey, pack your shit, we're moving. And you're like, whoa, wait a minute, what? Like there's no warning, right? Yep, we're moving. Get your stuff. I mean, I even had to go ask a platoon sergeant, like, I was a squad leader. I'm like, is this really happening? And they're like, yep, this isn't a drill. Like, get your stuff together. We're going. And so sure enough, we loaded up and we crossed the berm into Iraq and just started heading north from Kuwait, and went to a small town called Al Kut first. And that was weird. Like the first night we rolled in there, we get set up on this old air base. And the first night we go in the city, they'd made a curfew. They were like, hey, there's a curfew. No males over the age of 18 are allowed in the city after dark or whatever. And so we load up in our Humvees and we go rolling into the city, and it's just like we are taking the city over. So I just remember like rolling down the main street, and all of a sudden you saw these guys out in the street, and we just bam, come rolling up in our Humvees, jump out, guns drawn, get on the ground. We're just yelling at them all to lay down, lay down, lay down. And we're just handcuffing them and taking them back to the police station. And there's really no police station because we're having to establish it. And it was pretty chaos, you know, it was pretty chaotic for the first week or two. And then we kind of got our systems established, and now we're just out patrolling and trying to train the police on how to be policemen. And we did that. And anyways, we were there for 6 months. It wasn't too bad there. We had a couple incidents with, I remember one, not in my platoon alone, but there was a platoon that someone dropped a hand grenade he was on a security point at the police station, and there was higher buildings around us. Anyway, somehow someone had dropped a grenade in there. And I remember that, you know, like it didn't kill him, it just injured him. But then at 6 month mark, we moved to Karbala, Iraq. And that was a whole different beast. Big city. 101st had already rolled through there and kind of eliminated every threat in the city. Now we were going up there to establish the policing operations. And so we rolled up there. And that was like I said, bigger scenario. My platoon was the lead element going up there to get established on this base camp outside of the city, which we did. And then we spent the last 6 months there, and that was, it was heavy there, a bigger city, like I said, a bigger threat. Our first firefight really, that we got into was on October 16th of 2003. That's where we got essentially ambushed by about 200 guys, high-rise buildings all around us. It killed my battalion commander. He was killed in that firefight. At the time, he was the highest ranking American soldier to be killed in Iraq. Like I said, my best friend got shot multiple times. We lost 2 other soldiers, a guy named Sergeant Sean Grilly and a Staff Sergeant Joseph Bellavia. So 3 guys got killed in that firefight. Obviously the big thing was, oh my gosh, your battalion commander got killed, not what you expect, that was the first real, like, holy crap, man, like, this is what you've been training to do, and now it's real.
So where were you when tell me that story, if you don't mind. Do you mind telling me your
No,
part
I'm
of the story?
good with telling it. So here's the story. So we rolled into Karbala in beginning probably September of 2003. And at the beginning of October, I was out on patrol. So I'm a squad leader, and in the MP world, probably like other MOSs too, but in the MP world, the mission is driven around squad leaders out patrolling. And so I was out patrolling, and we rolled through this checkpoint in the city, and my interpreter, he was like, hey, there's those guys had weapons back there. And I was like, what? So we roll back around the block, we come back through it. And so it's really an illegal checkpoint. And right by that checkpoint is a mosque, and it's in the middle of the city. And so I'm like, oh crap. So we pull our trucks over. I jump out, all my team leaders jump out, we lock and load, we draw down on these guys, and we're like, put your weapons on the ground, and well, like all of a sudden 10 guys turns into like 200 guys. They're like coming out of the woodwork, like out of the alleys. And there was like a bunch of guys laying on the sidewalk in front of these buildings, but they were just laying there. Like they didn't look like a threat. Well, as soon as we drew, like they all got up and they had like these giant swords and guns. It was wild, right? And I'm like, I literally remember, like, I look around, I look at my team leaders, and I'm like, get back in the trucks, get back in the trucks, right? So we jump in the trucks, and because I'm like, we were way outnumbered and we're just going to get our butts handed to us. So jump in the truck and we leave. And I call back to my talk, and my first sergeant, he was out in the city that night patrolling with his own squad. And so I called him up and I'm like, hey, this just went down. Like, this was crazy. Like, you know, we almost walked into a storm of fire here. So they sent it up to higher, and it came back and they're like, hey, just leave them alone. Apparently it's like a mosque leader that lives there. And there's another unit that was there before us that caused some issues with them. And so it's a pretty tense situation, and we're going to deal with it politically. Okay. So I go about my business. Well, 2 weeks later, there is another mosque in the city, and there's like two factions that are at war in the city over this mosque. And like, so we're just kind of told, hey, don't go patrolling in that area because it is a war over there. And it was like, they're RPGing the crap out of each other. There's gunfire in the streets. You know, they're just, boy, whoever it was, these two factions are fighting over this mosque. Well, my battalion commander comes up to deal with this kind of on the political level, right? And I remember driving over to that mosque. The firefighting had kind of stopped. And so I remember driving over there, and there's security all around, and my battalion commander is dealing with that the war fighting mosque. And meanwhile, there's that other group is over there still running their illegal checkpoint. And apparently there was a conversation between my battalion commander and a platoon leader about dealing with that. And the platoon leader's like, well, we were told to stay away from it because they're going to deal with it politically. And the battalion commander essentially was like, you can go fix it, or I'll find somebody that will. Well, you know, you challenge that platoon leader. So he sends a squad over there, and that squad is what has Sergeant Bellavia in it. So they're over there trying to deal with, you know, whatever. At this time, I'm rolling into the city because we worked in shifts there. You know, you had one platoon at the police station for 8-hour shifts every day. So as I'm rolling into the city, I go there's a traffic circle right by that area, and I see Bellavia's squad there, and I'm like, what are they doing? Like, they're not supposed to be there. We were told to leave it alone. Well, I didn't know all the other backstory at that time. All right, well, it's my night to work at the police station. 2 other squads patrol the city while one runs the police station. So I keep driving to the police station. I go there, I get set up. And meanwhile, over the radio, Sergeant Bellavia is like, hey, I think I've got them to put their weapons down. You know, I think but I need some more people over here. Like, it's just my squad. I need some more help. Well, the battalion commander, his squad, he's done dealing with whatever he was dealing with at the other mosque. He says, I'll go over there. So he drives over there, and now he's dealing with them, right? So you got Bellavia's squad, the Colonel Orlando's security squad, and then my first sergeant, his squad went over there also. So they're all set up over there. They're all dealing with these guys. I'm at the police station. I'm talking and I walk in there, and the platoon leader for that platoon is there. And I'm like, why are you over there? Like, we're not supposed to be over there. And he's like, this is why I'm there. Blah, you know, he explains the situation to me, and I'm like, okay. Well, and then I'm like, well, he goes, they're right here. And he like pointed at this spot on the map. And I'm like, no, they're not right there. They're right here. And like, no sooner than I touch the map, all of a sudden, like, because they're about 3 blocks away, you just hear boom, boom, like all these explosions and then a bunch of gunfire. And I'm like, what in the world just happened? So I look at my platoon sergeant who's in the police station with me, and we're like doing our transfer out with that platoon, you know, so they can leave. And I just look at him. I'm like, can I go? Can I go? And he's like, go, get in your trucks and go. So I run back out to the back of them. I'm like, tell my team leaders, get in the trucks. Let's go. So we load up quickly, and we go hauling ass over to where the direction of this firefight. So what had happened out there was they had a conversation. They'd gotten these guys supposedly to agree to put their weapons down, whatever. Well, my battalion commander's squad rolls up there. He gets out of his truck, and now he's having this conversation with the bad guy leader, I guess. That's the best way to describe it. And he's like, somehow the conversation degrades more and more. And my first sergeant, he's standing there with his rifle. And so they're all kind of, it's like, showdown at the AOK corral or whatever. And one of the bad guys essentially tells my first sergeant, put your weapon down. And the first sergeant's like, that ain't happening, right? Well, somehow it escalates immediately to this dude raises up his weapon, and they're like, oh shit. Well, my best friend, he's the PSD squad leader for the battalion commander. So he's standing right next to the battalion commander, and all hell breaks loose. Gunshots start going off. The colonel and Staff Sergeant West, who's my best friend, they get shot, go down, fall on the ground. And so Josh West, Sergeant West, is shot in the legs. He can't get back up. Colonel Orlando's been shot, can't really see where. And all the other trucks, like, all hell breaks loose. They got saw gunners, right? And so they just turn to the left and right and just start mowing people down. And now it's like the bad guys, they're in these 2- and 3-story buildings around the area. And so they just start coming up out of the windows, and they're just raining down hand grenades, and RPGs are firing and gunfire from everywhere. So now I'm hauling ass over there. And by the time I roll up in there, the gunfire had there was a lull in it, right? So I pull up on the scene, I jump out, I go over, I talk to my first sergeant because his truck is backed out of the firefight. I run over to him and I'm like, what's going on? And he's like, I need everybody out of the kill zone. I'm like, okay. And there's trucks up in the middle of the road still. I can see them. It's dark out. All the power has been shut off in that area. All of a sudden the power went out. My first sergeant's gunner, she'd taken some shrapnel to the face. Well, I just happened to have the medic in my truck. So I run over and grab the medic and I'm like, go fix her, And so she comes out of the turret and she's all bloody. And so anyhow, I go and tell my truck, I'm like, hey, we got to get these guys out of the kill zone. And so I'm like, I'm going to go in dismounted. You keep the truck between me and everything on the right side of the road. So I'm staying on the left side of the truck, right? I don't know why I made that decision. My assumption, looking back on it, is if I'd gotten back in the truck, I couldn't see, feel, hear, smell, like all my senses are blocked by the truck, So now I'm walking next to the truck. We're going slow. And I get to this alley. There's an alley on my left just before I get to the mosque building. Right as I get to that alley, all of a sudden, I hear a whoosh and I see a flash of light. And then there's an explosion on the right side of me. Well, what had happened was there was 2 guys in that alley to my left. And as I'm driving, walking up, they fired an RPG at us. It went right over my head, right by my gunner, and then blew up in the alley on the right. So I'm like, oh shit, right? I turn and look down that alley, and I tell my gunner, he turns that way, and I'm like, fire him up. So he just starts put like 92 rounds down that alley, and it was 2 guys underneath a light pole. And so I'm like, did you hit him? He's like, or I tore up that light pole. I'm like, well, okay. Well, because of that, now the shit hits the fan again, right? Like, gunfire started, so it just blares up again. So now, and I'm like trying to get, because now it's just gunfire from everywhere. So I'm trying to get back in the truck now. I open the back door, I jump in. I tell my driver, drive forward again. So now he's kind of rolling into the kill zone. Well, at that time, all the other trucks are coming out of the kill zone. So they're backing out. I jump back out of the truck. I run up to the first truck that I see. I open up the back door. There's a guy slumped over in the back seat. The driver, he's all dazed and confused. I'm like, who is this? And he's like, he's been hit. And I'm like, no shit, who is it? And he's like, it's Bellavia. So I grab Bellavia and I kind of pick him up, and he's assumedly dead. I say that for a reason. I put him back down. I let him go, and I'm like, just get the hell out of here and, get him evac. So he evacs him out. And by this point, everybody's starting to pull out of the kill zone, right? So we've laid down enough cover fire now that we're getting everybody out of there, right? The colonel, his squad had already evac'd him out. He was on his way back to our base camp. So now my truck backs out and I'm running next, out with the truck. So we're out of the kill zone, right? Well, there's a lull again. And I'm like, all right, I got everybody. I got all the trucks are out of there. And I go to run over to my first sergeant's truck again. He's like across this median. So I go to run over to his truck. And as I'm running towards him, he like turns around and leaves. And I'm just like, okay. So now I'm like, it was kind of surreal, but I'm like standing under this street light. All the trucks are leaving. And I'm just out there in the open. There's, like I said, there's a lull in the fire. But I just start yelling at my gunner. His name was Lane. And I'm like, Lane. And he will not, he's like, he's trained on looking at the kill zone, right? To make sure no enemies coming towards us. But I'm like trying to get his attention because I'm like, bring the truck over here. Because I'm just out in the dead open underneath the street light, waiting to get shot essentially. And so I'm like, Lane, I'm just yelling at him. Finally, he looks over at me. He's like, you can just see his face. He's like, oh shit. And he looks down in the turret and tells the driver, take the truck over there. So they turn around and I run over and jump in it. And then we, head back and we reconsolidate at the police station. And, bottom line is we got everybody out of there. Unfortunately, we lost those three. But they evac'd, Colonel Orlando and Sergeant West back to, and I think Bellavia wound up going back there. And anyways, we did evac some people to the police station. There was one guy, he'd been shot right underneath his vest and it went into his spine. And so he was having some paralysis issues. So that was the first real, reality of fighting, so yeah.
So did you find out if you ever hit those guys at the street light with the saw?
I don't know. You don't stick around long enough, and I'll tell you, like, some people out there will say I'm crazy and that, oh, you're full of shit. But unless you're a sniper, it's really hard to know that you have a confirmed kill. It's just blaze of glory and you're just fighting your butt off to get out of there. And unless you look someone dead in the face and you shot them, you're probably not sure if you shot them. You just hope that you get everybody out of there and you went to fight another day. And we did, we, like I said, unfortunately we lost some people. Those people that were killed, Colonel Orlando and Sergeant Bellavia and Sergeant Gurley, they were in the fight, right? Like they're in the beginning of it when it hit the fan. And, so it's just a truly unfortunate loss, but, and even those guys that got injured, Josh, he still deals with it. And the guy that got shot in his spine, his name's Mike. He, they and Sanchez, the gunner for the first round, they deal with it still, obviously, mentally, probably more than anything. But so I don't know if we killed those guys. You don't stick around to find out, right? You fight, and then when you're able to say you probably got out of there and won. And ultimately, they brought a whole armored brigade into the city. I just remember our camp filling up with a bunch of tanks and Bradleys, more than I'd ever seen. I mean, in my career, and we did a big brief. And I will say, like, after this firefight happened, obviously the battalion commander is killed, so the XO of the battalion becomes the battalion commander. And he comes up and the sergeant major comes up. They were down in Hilla at the time. So they come up. Well, I had to drive for the next 3 days. I had to drive the battalion commander around to all these meetings because, like, General Sanchez, who was in charge of all Iraq at the time, he comes flying down there, and we have to go to all these briefings. Well, I was the last element in the fight, and so I had to like go and brief, like, what happened, why did it happen. I'm just some staff sergeant rolling around there trying to explain to people, like, that's what happened, this is why, this is where we went, whatever. And anyhow, they eventually brought in that armor brigade and they rolled into the city and cleared the city again, building by building. So yeah, we dealt with that. And then it was pretty quiet until December. And then our base camp got car bombed. Our camp plus the police station plus the Bulgarian compound all got car bombed simultaneously in December. And I wasn't there at the time. I was actually going to an Audie Murphy board at the time. So yes, Audie Murphy boards didn't stop because we were in war. And it was probably harder because I'm trying to fight the fight and study for an Audie Murphy board. And so I was up in Mosul at the time, competing for, and ultimately got accepted into the Audie Murphy Club. And then in January of 2004, they have a big pilgrimage to Karbala. It's kind of like their Mecca, right? And so we were in Karbala, and they are there's like 1 million people that come to the city of Karbala. There's these two big mosques that we're not allowed to go near. It's all cordoned off, so Americans aren't allowed near them. Anyhow, they're like, hey, we're gonna stay on our base camp for like this week, however long that pilgrimage was. So we're there, and all of a sudden, out in the distance, we hear these explosions, just faint, like boom, boom. We were all kind of like, what in the world is going on? So we're sitting there on the perimeter garden. So that they make us all push out to the perimeter to guard our base camp because we're like, what the heck's going on? Well, after about an hour, my first sergeant comes to me and he's like, hey, you got your squad here? I'm like, yeah. He's like, I need you to go in the city and figure out what happened. I'm like, okay, interesting. So we load up our trucks, go rolling down the highway, and we had to like go in this back way into the city because there's just so many people. It's just 1 million people in the city. Eventually it gets to the point where I can't drive anymore. So I get out. Now I'm dismounted and we're walking along. Well, come to find out, there were a bunch of suicide bombers that came into the city, and they were just walking up into crowds, blowing themselves up. And this was like the first time the country had seen suicide bombers, right? There hadn't been a tactic used yet. And I'm like, what in the world? So I'm like walking down the street, and like all these Iraqis are like, mister, come over here. They're like showing me a pile of shoes and this giant blood spatter on the ground. And I'm like, what? And they're like, boom, boom. And I'm like, I'm confused at like, what? Because we hadn't heard of this tactic, right? And I'm like, suicide bombers? And they're like, yes. Yeah. My translator's trying to translate for me. And sure enough, man, like we got hit by about 5 or 6 suicide bombers. So now I'm like walking around going, I hope another dude doesn't just walk up to me, And it was really like, I'll tell you some weird stuff. Like, I'm walking through the city, and like they just come up to you. They got a bag, right? They open up the bag, and there's just one of the suicide bombers' heads in there. They're like, here's his head. And I'm like, what? Like, okay, thanks. So I see it, and they're like, and then it disappears, right? Well, then all of a sudden this lady comes up to me, and which is odd in Iraq that a lady's talking to you, but she's in like full, looks just like she blends in with everybody else. And she has full burqa on, and she walks up to me, and this is literally what I hear. So what happened here? What did you just say? What happened here? I'm like, who are you? Oh, I'm so-and-so from the Associated Press. So she's like a reporter out there, but she's like fully dressed up, right? So I tell her, I'm like, oh, we think it's suicide bombers, I'm just giving her info. But like, it was really weird because I'm like, this lady just talked normal English to me, and she got her story, asked me who I was, and boom, gone. She disappeared. And later on, there's an article out there about it. That, I talked to Staff Sergeant VanKleek, I'm like, I mean, you know what you're allowed to say and what you're not allowed to say. But but then like a week later, the CIA came to our camp, and I had to go be interviewed by them. And they're like, so what did you see? And I'm like, oh, I walked through the city and I saw, I'm explaining everything. And I tell them about this. They walked up to me with this head in a bag, and they were like, did you get the head? And I'm like, no, I didn't get the head. And they're like, we really wish you would have gotten the head. Like, then we would have been able to identify who these people were. And I'm thinking, well, sorry, but I don't work for the CIA, and I wasn't lugging some dude's head around in a bag, but I didn't think that way. But sure enough, I should have gotten the guy's head. So, that was January. And then we redeployed back home in April. So that was probably, the brunt of that whole adventure for OIF1 for sure.
Oh wow, that's amazing. It's just baffling to. So you were there when the first suicide bombers started, right? Wow.
Yeah, I mean, from what we recall, they were like, everyone was kind of confused, like, what, suicide bombers? And it's kind of like IEDs, right? So IEDs weren't there at the beginning, right? It was just like all of a sudden one day you started hearing these rumors, and we had a guy, he was rolling down the highway and got hit by an IED, and you're like, what is this IED thing? Well, back then it was just like fuel cans they would bury in the road and blow up, right? It wasn't anything technical. But it was like a new tactic we'd never even heard of. And same thing, the suicide bomber thing was a tactic we hadn't even heard of. And here I am walking around looking at blood spatters on the ground and shoes everywhere. So it was pretty wild.
You watched communications develop over your career. If you came in the mid 90s, you saw Singar's radios, transition, all the way to real squad intercommunications, right?
Yep.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's my first deployment was, back in, real first deployment, 03, that we dealt with probably communications. Obviously, like I said, I transported prisoners, but we did it on plane, totally different. But, by the time OIF1 hit, we were using ASIPs, the smaller version of the Singars. But that was really like when we first started using headsets, right? Like you had headsets you used inside the trucks. We were using Humvees. We didn't have MRAPs or anything like that yet. And communications were rough, I mean, I can remember actually when we were in Karbala. I'm a squad leader. And they were like, hey, we need you to go to this town south of Karbala. It's like halfway between Karbala and Hilla. And we just need you to go make contact with the police down there and kind of figure out, we've never talked to those police down there. What are they doing? What do they have for equipment? What's what's the crime like down there? And so, I go rolling down there, and I'm telling you right now, I was out of communications with anybody for 6 hours because the ASIPs didn't reach all the way back to, Karbala. And, we would do radio checks. Eventually you weren't getting a response. And then you're just down there in this town. Like, I hope we don't get attacked, I mean, and then I deployed again in 2008. I was there for 15 months deployment from 08 to 09 in Iraq, in Baghdad this time. And communications were better. We were still using kind of the same radios though. But then when I deployed again to Afghanistan in 2012 as a first sergeant, and they were bringing in, like, my squad leaders had cell phones with GPS maps built into them. And I don't know, I'm not a communications guy, right? I'm not a signal guy. So I don't know a ton about it, but no doubt you saw that progression. As a private, I'm using the Singars, right? The put it in a man pack and carry that sucker in a rucksack, right? That's what you had to use. Now OIF1, where ASIPs are part of the scheme, and now they grow and you get a little more communication. But then, like I said, when I deployed in 2012, my squad leaders were starting to get these I don't want to say cell phones, that's probably not the right answer, like tablets, and they were putting those into the trucks and using these tablets to get around. And I mean, I think in OIF1 we used BFTs, Blue Force trackers, right? But as time went on, they got more advanced also. I didn't personally, my team leaders used them. I rolled with a team leader, so I didn't really personally use one, but yeah, no doubt communication and the way we battle track definitely grew. And I saw it from being a squad leader out there on the ground, fighting the fight, to in 2008, 2009, I'm an operations sergeant running the talk, right? Seeing it from that side, BFTs and mapping and whatnot, to then, okay, now I'm a first sergeant in 2012, and I'm not necessarily in the talk every day because I'm out doing ALOC stuff, but I'm watching those guys and what they're tracking with, and it definitely grew, definitely changed over time.
Tell me about being a first sergeant and deploying to combat.
It was fun. I mean, I think I was a good first sergeant. You're not going to please everybody, you know. I mean, there's some soldier out there that probably thinks I was the worst first sergeant on the planet, and that's okay. I'm good with that. But you know, we deployed to Afghanistan. Like I said, I had some guys outlying areas. But they were embedded into some police stations out there. We had it good because we lived on our own little camp. It was like my company plus 140 Dying Corps civilians. And then, it was really kind of interesting because they ran our DFAC and stuff. My focus there was, and my focus as a first sergeant was really just, hey, these are the standards. I'm going to enforce them. And then trying to make life enjoyable outside of the fight. You know, I will tell you this, the weird part about my deployment was I'm an MP company, and I don't know if you know what you know about the structure of an MP company, but we're large. We have everything embedded with us. I have cooks, I have supply, I have signal guys, I have mechanics, a lot of mechanics, right? Medics, they're all embedded with me. And so when I deployed, though, I was attached to a CAV squadron. Well, a CAV squadron, they're not built the same way, right? They're much smaller. They're like an infantry platoon, so they're much smaller. They have a support platoon that is all your support MOSs that kind of go out and help you. And so it was a little bit of a struggle because I'm like my operations cell for an MP company back then was 2 master sergeants. So there's 3 master sergeants in a MP company. Me as the first sergeant, and then 2 master sergeants plus 2 sergeant first classes working in my ops. Well, hell, that's almost as big as the whole CAV squadron's ops cell, you know. And so we had some struggles because they would send down orders, and I think a normal CAV company troop, right, a CAV troop, it's some staffs aren't in their ops cell. Oh, hey, battalion said do this, we're doing it, right? And they execute. Well, you'd said stuff to us, and my guys are battle staff certified, and they're like, hey, this doesn't make sense. And they would fire stuff back, and the CAV squadron would get so pissed off at us because, what do you mean you're not, you know, why are you firing back? Like, well, because your order doesn't make sense, and we're trained just like you. And that's not to badmouth them. It was just the reality of how we're trained versus how they're, because we're built to deploy on our own. Well, then, like, even one day, the battalion sergeant major was like, hey, why are you not using he's like, why are you not using the support platoon to bring your supplies to you? And I looked at him and I was like, I don't even know what you're talking about. And he's like, yeah, I have a whole platoon. They'll just bring you all your stuff. I'm like, sergeant major, I have a whole platoon that's what they do every day. They run log packs. He's like, what? I'm like, yeah, I have like 4 supply guys. I have medics. They do that for me. I don't need you to do that for me. So it was kind of weird. You know, it was a little growing pain and figuring each other out. And then I would just resource everything myself. But anyhow, I mean, being a first sergeant was good. Unfortunately, we did lose 1 soldier. He died. Honestly, he died of a freak medical accident. But let me tell you this. I wrote a paper about this in the academy when I went to the Sergeant Major Academy. We always talk about second and third order effects, right? And I like to ask soldiers all the time, like, what does that even mean? We say it, but what does it mean? Well, I'm going to give you an example. So I had a staff sergeant, and good staff sergeant, and he got sick. Well, let me back that up. They were in an outlying area, and we finally got to pull them back to our base camp, right? Cop Shurndam is where we lived. And so we were able to pull them back. So they get pulled back. They're living with us now. Life is pretty good compared to where they were living when you're embedded in a police station. Life is pretty good. Well, this is around the time in 2012 that an NCO from another unit in the Panjway district. He just like left his camp in the middle of the night, went out and killed some people. I don't remember if he was a staff sergeant. I think he was a sergeant first class. Anyways, the dude just left his base camp, went out into the city and murdered people in their homes, and then came back. He's in jail now for it, right? Well, because he did this, we were put on a no roll across the country because obviously the Afghani population is pretty pissed off, right? So they're like, hey, we can't roll anywhere. So at that same time, this staff sergeant's name's Grindy. Staff Sergeant Grindy gets sick and he's got some stomach pain. But we couldn't evac him. Why? Because we're on a no roll. So I have medics on my camp. And so they're trying to diagnose him. They call Fob Walton, where the next like roll 2 or whatever it is where they're located. They wind up calling Kandahar, where the roll 1 or 3, whichever number it is, roll 3, I think. But bottom line is everybody's like, it sounds like it's kidney stones. So they just tell him to, go lay in bed. Here's some painkillers, whatever. Well, he's not getting better. And the next day, some of my dying corps civilians find him passed out by a porta-john. And so he'd gotten up to go to the bathroom. He was in so much pain, he passed out. They scoop him up, bring him to the aid station. Well, in our world, as a first sergeant, none of my guys are allowed to be out in sector. And so it's really like, oh man, this is kind of a relief. Like my guys are all home safe on the base, right? Like I'm living life, right? Like I don't have anything to worry about. And all of a sudden you hear over the intercom, we have an intercom on our camp, and they're like, all medics respond to the aid station. So I'm like, whoa, what the heck is going on? Right? Like, why are all my medics being called? So I go there and he's having issues. So they're trying to deal with him. Figure out what's wrong with him. And so now I'm like, I'm going to the talk because we need a medevac. So I get up to the talk and they're like struggling to get a medevac approved. They're like, hey, we need a medevac. And they're like, we can't send a medevac. They're like, you're not hearing me. Like, I need a medevac. We can't, no roll. No one's allowed to leave, whatever. I'm literally on the other side of the mountain from Kandahar. I can cross a mountain and be on CAF. So at somewhere in there, Sergeant Grindy like throws up a bunch of blood, and they're like, holy shit, like he's not good. So they load him up and they just start transporting him out to the landing, to the medevac site. And I'm like, what in the world is taking so freaking long to get a medevac here? Like I need a medevac, right? Well, bottom line is he essentially passes away on his way out to the landing, to the LZ. And they're like working on it. My medics are working their ass off to keep him alive. And all of a sudden, and now I'm like, what the hell? Like now I'm pissed because I just see him working on him. And I'm like, so I go to start running back to the talk. And all of a sudden, these 2 helicopters just appear out of nowhere. So one just like, I don't even know where they came from, but boom, there's 2 birds. One just starts flying overhead. He's essentially pulling security. The other one slams on the ground. Well, it just happens that the medic jumps out of that bird, runs over, and is like, "What do you need?" And they're like, "We need him on the." He's like, "Holy shit, get him on the bird now!" So they put him on the bird. They're gone within 30 seconds. Bottom line is, Sergeant Grindy doesn't survive. He does die, and but that medevac wasn't even meant for us. What it is 2 PJ birds from the Air Force were out flying and just happened to hear us calling on the radio, like, we need a medevac. This isn't we don't have a choice here. They just happened to hear it and they just diverted over to us, landed, picked him up, and took him. But my whole point to that story is that, in my opinion, Sergeant Grindy's death is a second and third order effect of that idiot going out into the Panjway district and causing a no roll. Because he did that, we couldn't roll, and because of that, Sergeant Grindy died. Because if we were not on a no roll, we would have evacuated him to Walton or CAF, and maybe they would have discovered what was wrong with him, and then he would have not been killed. And so I always use that as my example of second and third order effects, and they killed a soldier. So that guy has blood on his hands of going out and murdering Afghanis in their homes. But in my opinion, he has blood on his hands because my NCO died. So anyhow.
Hey, I get it. Totally understand. Makes sense. Thanks for sharing that. You know,
Yeah.
it's tough to do a memorial service for a soldier. I had to do 3 as a first sergeant, and you know, that's tough, right?
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit, as you know, you've retired and you're living the RV life and doing all that stuff, you know, you and Amanda, tell me a little bit about your patriotism.
I mean, obviously I spent 24 years in the Army, right? I mean, I love America. And I love what we stand for. And you know, I'm pretty central of the road on politics. So I don't get wrapped up in the political side of it too much. I mean, I think everybody's got their opinion. But I will tell you, living this life, the traveling life, there's a lot of America to see, and there's a lot of America that we don't ever see. And I think it's been pretty eye-opening to me as I've traveled. I went to the Southeast for the winter. But I'll tell you, like, I spent a month in Montgomery, Alabama, and it was eye-opening to really see, touch, learn about the beginning of the civil rights movement, right? Because that's where civil rights started, was in Montgomery, Alabama. And so pretty eye-opening. And then, you know, we've been up here in the north. We rolled up here in May. We spent a month in Duluth. And when we decided to go to Duluth, it was kind of like, what are you going to do in Duluth, Minnesota? Right. But we found a lot to do, and going up to the Boundary Waters and just learning, seeing things that you probably wouldn't. And I think it instills a little, even more patriotism in you, because you live your Army life, you know, I'm around military bases and all the people are like me. But then you come out here and I'm just seeing America, you know? So, I mean, like I said, you don't do 24 years and not feel patriotic, right? But you know, yeah, I mean, that I think that's the biggest advantage to this lifestyle is I'm seeing America, a lot of America that you don't get to see. And we don't have a deadline. Like, we just said we're going to travel. We might be 2 years, might be 10 years, might be 20 years. And our goal, you know, so we're here, you know, through the summer up north. Our goal is, like I said, 70-degree weather. So then our goal next year is travel the Southwest, wind up over in the Northwest next year, next summer up into the Northwest. But eventually we want to go to Alaska. Eventually we want to go up into Maine and the Northeast, and you know, we just kind of figured out as we go. So yeah.
When you were deployed and you know, all your times, who is it that prayed for you at night, you know, that cared for you and sent you those care packages and those kinds of things? You know, did you have a group behind you that really,
I mean,
takes
you
care
know,
of you like that?
I mean, obviously my parents, right? Especially OIF 1 and whatnot. To them, it's just as real, because even though I grew up in an Army family, it's not, you know, my dad was a Cold War era guy, right? And so you didn't really go to war. Whereas I was probably, you know, I'm the first generation of, you know, my older brother, he went to Haiti, but same thing. It was like, you know, you were going there to help the country out more than anything. So, you know, my mom and my parents, you know, obviously they had their own stress of life in it. I didn't get married until 2011. And so, I mean, I probably had some girlfriends in there somewhere, you know, but, you know, then obviously my wife, you know, it's the real deal to her too, that, hey, I'm deploying all of 2012. And I think the harder part for us to understand as soldiers is that we live that life every day. And so when we deploy, we're just working our job, you know, and you don't realize the stress that it causes back on the home front, because you're just doing, like, the thing is, most of your time deployed isn't very exciting. You know, it's pretty boring. whether it's patrolling or just sitting around on the fob or pulling, guard duty. It ain't super exciting, but they don't know that, right? Like your home front, they think every day is just this action. It's like being a police officer, right? Like being a police officer, 99% of the time is just driving around being bored. But there's the 1% that's crazy, and that makes up for the other 99. That's for sure. And I think the same thing is probably true with most deployments. And I know some deployments are rougher than others, and they see more action, enemy contact than others. But in reality, the majority of your day isn't super exciting. But the home front doesn't know that. The home front just thinks that every day is stressful, and you're out punching the enemy in the face.
So give us your best recruit. Let's so a couple things as we begin to like close this out. I've been having folks call their last unit to attention and then salute and sign out. Just to get that on tape, on camera. I think it's awesome for a leader to call his unit to attention. I love that. I would.
My last unit isn't very exciting, so it'd be hard to do that. But
no, you just say battalion attention.
I got you.
It'll be all right. And then, I don't know. Leave us with some advice that you might give to someone that that might be thinking about joining the Army or making a decision to be serve their country or be patriotic in some kind of way. Give us a command sergeant major lesson,
I would say that look at the Army as a job. And I got it. It's all encompassing, right? I mean, I tell people all the time, hey, as a leader, I had to care about everything that everybody did. And once you get out, it's kind of weird, right? Like my wife works a civilian job. And I use this as an example a lot of times. I'm like, hey, like my wife works a civilian job. And this lady that she works with a few years ago got a DUI, right? And so I'm like, oh my gosh, like, what did you have to do? What do they do for her? And my wife's like, we don't do anything. Like, she better be at work on Monday, right? And I'm like, what? That's just unheard of in our world. And so I get it that it's all encompassing. But I think what we sometimes fail to do is make people understand that the Army's it's a job, it's a career, and it's something to be proud of doing. Don't look at it, and nothing annoys me more than like it's a lesser choice than other choices. Because I can tell you this right now, that the opportunity that's afforded you in the Army, whether it's moving away from home, which is important, I think, get away from home, go do something else. Or if it's the college opportunity that's afforded to you, right? You're not paying for college loans and whatnot. But while you're going to college, you're also getting a steady paycheck from the Army. But even beyond that, I'm 43 years old. This is my life.
That's wild.
And I don't work. When I say I don't work, I do manage a custom millworking company, right? Like we make a lot of farewell gifts for units, and like that's what we do, right? Our big thing right now is custom lasered canteen cups, right? So I manage that with my brother-in-law. But being retired at 43, especially in this lifestyle, people see and they're like, we have Texas license plates. You're from Texas? Well, sort of. I full-time travel. How do you travel? You look so young. Yep, I'm 43, but I dedicated a career to the Army, and now I can live this life. And I think that's the biggest thing I preach to people is it's not for everybody. We don't ask you to join for 20 years. There's a reason we don't ask you to join for 20 years. But quit looking, or don't look at the Army as if it's the last option, because it's not. There's plenty of other options that are probably worse than the Army. And for what you get, and to be able to retire at the age that you do, I don't know that it can be beat. That's my honest opinion, unless you're walking into some huge corporation somewhere. But I've loved what I do, and I would encourage anybody to try it out. And it's not for everybody, but don't look at it as it's the last option either. Because I will tell you, I'm not a last option guy. I'm a pretty smart dude, and I'm pretty successful. And at the age of 43, I make more money than a lot of my friends do to do nothing. Why? Because I dedicated a career to the Army, and that's reality, So yeah, I mean, that's, get after it. I mean, it's been a good experience. And I think the last thing I would tell somebody, I didn't learn this until later on in life. I think we've done an better job of pushing this, but invest. Learn the importance of investing at the age of 18 instead. I started investing when I was 26. And I think that's probably just a lesson learned that I try to pass on to people is invest, because it will matter later on in your life. You don't see it at the age of 18 because you're not supposed to, because you're only 18. But I think those are probably my biggest lessons in life.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you just a few weird things, I mean, I've never drank in my life, so don't feel like never have I drank. Like, I don't know what beer tastes like. Right. So I just tell people that, I've never drank. I've never been divorced. I've never had an Article 15. I'm the anomaly, I mean, so it can be done, I mean, you can go out there and be, don't think that that's what it's all about. You don't have to get in trouble to succeed. You don't have to, just because you're in the Army doesn't mean it's just, everybody's an alcoholic or in trouble. I've battled depression. I've battled suicidal thoughts. I'm very open with that. I'm probably the most open senior leader when it comes to suicide prevention, because I've been there, as a staff sergeant. I was that depressed, so it can all be overcome. It's, and you can have it. And here I am today. I'm a retired command sergeant major. Have a good time with it, be successful with it.
I love it. Thanks so much for sharing and spending some time with me. I really have enjoyed it very, very much.
Well, thanks for asking me to come on, man. It's been fun. I love telling my story. I think there's value in hearing it. Yeah, I definitely, I appreciate what you're doing. I appreciate that you're capturing these stories, because I think, we have this I've had this discussion a few times in my career of, we've done a crappy job of capturing the story of the World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. Like, they have stories to tell. And so I appreciate that you're doing this. Is awesome.
Well, thank you very much. I'm enjoying it. Look, getting to talk to wonderful guys and gals, it is really cool. And there's so many heroes. Everybody has such an amazing story. So thanks. Close us out. Go ahead and call us to attention and salute and give us a good sign out. Wake up your neighbors.
All right, here we go. Battalion, attention, all out.
Oh, I love it. Thanks, Sergeant Major.
All right, brother. Good chatting with you.
Good chatting with you. That was a blast.
All right. Take it easy.